Hi, welcome back to another video. It's another week. In fact, it's week 1, season 2 of the Le Mans Ultimate Online Championship Series. And what a week it's been. So grab your snacks, get comfy, buckle up and enjoy the ride. As you can see, we're back at Le Mans, just where we finished off last season in the Online Championship Series, the Trophy Series. This time out, season 2, I decided to jump into the Multiclass Masters. As I said at the end of the season when I did my season review, it's Le Mans Ultimate. I wanted this so that I could do the multi-class racing. So when I saw the schedule for season 2, Multi-Class Masters called out to me. LMGT3s and hypercars in 90-minute races, 2x fuel multipliers, and wait for it, limited sets of tyres. Actually, let me correct myself. Not limited sets of tyres, limited numbers of tyres. So we'll get into that in a second.
Green.
This was race 3 of the week for me. It was actually a new time slot, 10 AM UTC. It has been a long time since I last climbed out of bed on a Sunday morning to race. So let me tell you, I wasn't quite sure how this race was going to end up. I didn't quite nail my qualifying lap, but I didn't choke either. Whereas in season 1, all the way through the season, whether it was in the fixed races, whether it was in the championship races, I just couldn't nail the laps when it came to qualifying. I couldn't fire up the tyres. I have no idea why. However, by the time I did my last race of season 1 in the Trophy Series, I was at least a little bit more comfortable extracting a little bit more pace around the circuit. So I possibly came into the season with a little bit more confidence and a little bit of a, increasing competence extracting the lap around Le Mans. Who knows? However, it meant that in the first race and the second race of the season, I knew that going into qualifying, I should at least qualify within 2 or 3 seconds of the guys that were on pole. Still too far off pole for my liking, but at least it wasn't the 4, 5, 6 seconds off pole that I was doing at the beginning of the season races in season 1. Between season 1 and season 2, I took a sabbatical. I didn't do any races in the off week. Instead, I just relaxed, I concentrated on myself, concentrated on work, and just caught up with Netflix and chill. So chilled, in fact, that I did the same thing I did in season 1. I didn't do a lot of practice laps during the week. My first laps at the circuit were actually maybe an hour, 2 hours ahead of the first race at most. And it paid off. It meant that I didn't over practice. And we'll come back to practice again. Practice was the theme of the week, but it meant that I wasn't fatigued. I wasn't worn out. I was still fresh. And it meant that I was so comfortable and relaxed when the race started that I decided for the first time in Le Mans Ultimate that I was going to try and be a little bit more strategic with my race, because I was comfortable that I wasn't going to be 4 or 5 seconds off the pace. I decided that I'm going to try and coast and clutch and see if I can save some fuel over the course of the race and maybe for the first time ever stretch to that extra lap at Le Mans. Spoiler, didn't work. I was so frustrated. I did really well, but no matter what I did, without lifting and coasting really early, I would get around to the back end of the lap. And first stint, I would get around to coming off Arnage and have just enough virtual energy and fuel to do another lap. The second stint, I did marginally better, entering the Porsche curves, but again, that was the point at which I had just enough virtual energy and fuel to do another lap, so I had to pit again. And on the final stint, coming off the Porsche curves, I again had just enough fuel to do another lap, just enough virtual energy, and I did not want to get the drive-through for running out of virtual energy. So I pitted again. I wasn't overly frustrated because I was still quite impressed that in just 2-3 weeks I had gone from absolutely sucking at Le Mans, being terrible, not having any pace at all, to being on pace with the other drivers that I was regularly racing in season 1. So I could afford in the first race to, throw a gamble, roll the dice and see if I could do something slightly different rather than just sitting in a slipstream or a draft lock train for the entire race. And I saved enough fuel each stint to save 5 seconds on pit lane. However, over the course of the next stint, I would lose the 5 seconds because I was at least a second slower per lap than the cars I was racing because I wasn't driving flat out for the entire lap, so just couldn't keep up with them. After 90 minutes of mixed weather conditions, I was happy enough that I got to the end of the race and finished in 7th position, which for me was quite a result. I haven't driven in the Multiclass Masters series before. This was my first season in it, and it was really good. It was exhilarating. I absolutely loved it. And it set me up for race 2. I'd got a race under my belt, got some practice in for the week, and was raring to go and try something else slightly different. So in the second race, I didn't try and fuel save. Instead, I decided to just go flat out because, again, what's the point in me not quite making it and saving enough fuel to do the extra lap and not quite making it fast enough to not lose the time I saved on pit lane on the next stint. So I raced flat out, balls to the wall, and did my best. And again, tried something slightly different. As you can see, the races this week started out wet, or at least damp. And then there was rain, and there was the chance that the track would dry out by the time the 90 minutes was over. However, in the first race, because the track looked like it was going to stay damp all the way to the end, I didn't change tyres. I ran the same wet set from the start to the finish, and as I said, I held on to that 7th place. However, in the second race, I decided that what I would do is I would take my cue off all the cars that were ahead of me racing. As they hit pit lane, crew chief Jim told me they were changing to mediums. So as I hit the lane, I changed to mediums too. And that's when the first bug of season 2 hit. I just wasn't aware it was going to happen. So I knew that there had been discussion about maybe mirroring what wet do and having a limited number of tyres for the race rather than having infinite amounts of tyres. But in my mind, I had understood it to be we were going to have a limited number of tyre sets, not tyres. So we started the race and we were only able to use 6 medium tyres and 6 wet tyres. Changing from wets to mediums shouldn't have had any difference. We should have been able to then use the 6 medium tyres if we'd wanted to. But the bug was that Le Mans Ultimate was counting the wet tyres as one set in your allocation of 4 tyres. So come pit time, changing to mediums, I thought I had changed all 4 tyres. As soon as I got off pit lane, I realised something was wrong. It only allowed me to change 2 tyres. I had medium slicks on the front and worn wets on the rears. Boy, can I tell you, the balance of the car through the final stint was, shall we say, interesting. I'm glad that it at least put the wets on the rear, well, left the wets on the rear I should say, and put the mediums on the front, because it meant I had good grip on turning on the dry-in track. And I could live with the fact that the rears were a bit worn. I could live with controlling the oversteer. I'm not quite sure I would have liked the idea of having slicks on the rear, worn wets on the front, and potentially going over a damp spot on turn-in or track out, or maybe even on the gas getting out of the apex. Yeah, I don't even want to know about that. One person that I race against regularly said what they did was put 2 wets on one side, right side, and 2 medium slicks on the left side. They said it worked really, really well, but to me that sounds fraught with danger. That just sounds like you're going to lose the car at any moment. But hey, let's hope that they get it fixed, but it doesn't seem like they'll be able to get it fixed for season 2, so we might have to go the entire season with that anomaly, where if the track is wet or dry, we have to be very careful about what tyres we put on at the start of the race, let alone what goes on the car if we change them at the pit stop. Talk about making life interesting, right? And when it comes to interesting, remember I said that I was nice and chilled, I didn't do any racing in the off season? Well, that chill meant that I was a little bit brain dead, so I completely forgot how to change the fuel levels when pitting. So instead of changing the amount of virtual energy, I convinced myself that I couldn't change that line in the MFD. I convinced myself that the only row I could change was the ratio of virtual energy. So I changed it to have enough fuel to make it to the end of the race on the splash and dash at the end of the 3rd stint. But I didn't realise what I was actually doing was filling up with 100% virtual energy and enough fuel to finish. So instead of me maximising on my race strategy and finishing on the podium, I ended up completely screwing myself over, sat on the pit lane waiting for the virtual energy to fill up as I lost 1, 2, 3 positions that I'd made up on track. But again, I wasn't overly frustrated. It was, my own fault. I was asleep at the wheel. I completely forgot how to race the car and how to manage the virtual energy at the pit stop. But again, I was just happy that race 2 into the season, again at Le Mans, I had reasonable pace. And again, I'm nowhere near as fast as the fastest, but I wasn't at the back. I wasn't falling off the back of the field. I was able to race, and on a wet track, on a damp track, on a slightly wet track, I was competitive with my peer set. And that, for me, was a win. Race 1, or week 1, race 1 and 2, I should say, of week 1 of the new Masterclass series. So race 3 was, yeah, it was all about seeing if I could make more points, maximize the week, and make back perhaps some of the points that I lost out to when I sat in the pit box watching my hopes and dreams evaporate faster than the water on the drying race line in the races this week. So when I turned up to this race, the final race of the week, even though it was a Sunday morning, I felt as prepared as ever for a race at Le Mans. I knew what the weather was going to do, well, at least 95% certain what the weather was going to do, but I 100% knew what I was going to do on track. No fuel saving, it wasn't worth it, I wasn't going to compromise my pace, and most definitely no changing tyres. I was going to make sure that the wet tyres made it all the way to the end, and I was going to maximise my strategy, I was going to maximise my pace, and I was going to, fingers crossed, come away with my best result of the week, as long as everything went well and I didn't have another moment of brain fade. And for all intents and purposes, that is exactly what happened. I pretty much executed 100% the best race I possibly could have pulled off at Le Mans this week. I didn't qualify as well as I could have, but I didn't choke. I started in the middle of the pack of the LMGT3 field, and I survived that hip check moment off the start-finish line. It again, possibly in hindsight, I could have given the car on my right an even wider berth going out of the Ford chicane, but I just didn't expect on a wet track, as the green went, that they would just floor it and bounce off the curb and, as I said, hip check me. At the time, my crew chief told me that I had significant aero damage, and my heart sunk. I had a feeling that I was going to either have a puncture or bent suspension, or I was going to be slowed down the Mulsanne straight, because significant aero damage is not what you want to hear as you're starting a 90-minute race at one of the fastest low downforce circuits we're going to see on the series schedule. However, by the time I got down to the PlayStation chicane and the Michelin chicane, and then made it down to Mulsanne corner, I could see that I was still able to stay with the cars ahead. The steering wheel was straight, I wasn't one hand down left or right, and the car appeared to be undamaged. So immediately I just put the incident out of my mind and just focused forward on racing my best race. Now my heart rate at this point seemed to be quite reasonable, 130, 135 beats per minute, but I knew that as soon as I got into the wheel-to-wheel racing, when the spray started to hang in the air and I was just off the back of the car ahead, I knew that my heart rate would start to get elevated, and I know that I would start to get a little bit tight on the wheel. So I was trying to concentrate on being calm, collected. I'd done enough racing for the week. I'd got enough practice under my belt. There were no surprises. I just had to enjoy myself, ensure that I drove my most relaxed, chilled and composed race, and just enjoy the elements. I mean, who doesn't enjoy racing when it's raining? And this first stint was just perfect. Now perhaps I didn't execute the perfect lap every single lap, but I stayed with the pack. The conditions on track were changing. I wasn't running uber amounts of downforce either, whereas in season 1 and all the way through the initial races I've done during the weekly races at Le Mans, whenever it's rained, I've whacked on the extra downforce just to be that much more confident and certain that I wasn't going to track out off the track or lose the car under acceleration. Everything was going well. Everything was going to plan. Everything was under control. I put that element of composed control down to the fact that this was race 3. I already had circa 6 hours under my belt of lapping in these conditions, this car, this circuit, this week. And what impressed me the most, and when I say impressed me, I mean literally just impressing myself, was that I hadn't had to do what I used to do when trying to take sim racing seriously. Prior, I would spend hours midweek just doing practice laps, just Just seriously, just hundreds of practice laps, sometimes even thousands of practice laps. Maybe racing as though it was my second job, and it took the fun out of it. It made it way too tense, put too much on the line, and it meant that the race was a make it or break it. It was either going to be a really high, satisfying moment, or if something went wrong, a moment of dejection. And what I love about Le Mans Ultimate is the driving experience is so natural. I don't need to spend those extra laps trying to get to a point where I have the quote-unquote muscle memory locked down, so I know what the car's going to do, when the car's going to do it, and what the quirks of the physics engine mean the car's going to do in any given scenario. Le Mans Ultimate is just about racing. Now that I have almost 400 hours in game under my belt and over 110 races, the fact we only have 8 tracks on the circuit, it means I don't need to expend that additional time midweek practicing because we're all familiar with the tracks. And contrary to maybe popular opinion, I'm hoping that continues. Whilst I don't want the game to only ever have 8 or 9 tracks, it'll be good if Le Mans Ultimate is able to introduce some of the tracks from the previous series, Intercontinental Cup, or maybe even if the licensing allows them to have the European Le Mans Series tracks, or the American Le Mans Series tracks, or the Asian Le Mans Series track. That would be great. However, rather than there being 50, 60 different tracks that you could race on any given schedule, I'm glad that we get to go back to the same tracks and just focus on enjoying the racing, because we're not trying to learn new tracks every single week. But I know that's a controversial opinion. For other people, it's quite a case of monotony, and they would like to see a different track on the schedule every season to spice it up a bit. However, for me, these conditions, this track, this car was spicy enough. And I was so pleased with how the race was going. 30 minutes into the first stint, and I was still hanging with the cars ahead of me. I wasn't getting dropped like I was in the trophy series, and I was still in a position where I was thinking forward. I was thinking, how can I maximize on any mistakes that they make? And a mistake was about to happen, and I was about to make a position coming out of Mulsanne. I thought I can maybe make 2 positions, but the car on the left, well, let's just give the benefit of the doubt and assume that he didn't see me because I was in his blind spot. He tried to jink right, or perhaps, I don't know, maybe he was running less traction control than I was, and the car just kicked on him when he put his foot on the gas. But that was my second hip check of the race, and again I got away without any suspension damage, without a puncture, and without any significant aero damage that I could tell. However, what it did mean was that my heckles were up. I was determined that I was going to get that position, because now I wasn't quite in a purple mist. As you can see, it's a grey, wet, white mist, but I most definitely was in game on maximum attack mode. Just like every other race I've had in Le Mans Ultimate so far, whenever it comes to being lapped by the hypercars, I always seem to lose out. I don't yet remember a race where it paid off for me in my favour, where the cars I was racing got held up. The cars ahead of me always seemed to get caught as they came out of the Porsche curves. I got caught entering the Porsche curves, and just when I thought that maybe they would get balked exiting the Porsche curves, no, they would get a clean run off. So where I got right up on the cars out of Mulsanne and into Arnage, I found myself coming off the Porsche curves, and they again had a second, almost 2 seconds on me by the time we got to the Ford chicane. But I wasn't giving up. I was still in the groove. I was still having fun. I was still amazed that I was racing this well at Le Mans, because, have I mentioned it? In Season 1, I absolutely sucked. However, by the time we got to the Ford chicane and were coming off the Ford chicane, I got the gap back down to under a second. So it was another moment of refocus, regroup, shake it off. There's a long way to go yet. And this was going to be the lap where I had to consider what I was going to do when it came to the first pit stop, because you really want to get a clear run at pit lane. You don't want to get balked, but also I wanted to make sure that I didn't do something stupid on the lane, like get a drive-through penalty for speeding. So doing the mental arithmetic, trying to figure out how many stops I was going to have to make, how much virtual energy I'd need to take, how much fuel I'd need on board, but also how much I was taking out of the tires. All of that whilst trying to avoid all of the aquaplaning moments, all of the sliding wide moments, all of the being lapped by hypercar moments, basically all of the don't bleep this up mark moments. And speaking of bleeps, did I mention the heart rate getting up to 150 beats per minute, or did I not? And speaking of not, mentally I was screaming at the hypercars behind me, please don't try to overtake me on the hard shoulder on the left. I just had a fear that after 35 minutes of pretty decent racing, I was going to get wiped out because someone in the hypercar was a little bit ambitious and overly aggressive going into the PlayStation chicane. And speaking of being overly aggressive, did I mention earlier that after that hip check, that inadvertent hip check I should say, coming around Mulsanne, that I was intent on getting this position of the BMW in front. So to come off the PlayStation chicane less than half a second behind them, I knew I had to make or break. I either had to make the move into the Michelin chicane or I had to make it into Mulsanne. If I didn't make it into Mulsanne, I 100% had to get the job done before we got to Indianapolis. Otherwise, I was sure that BMW would just drive away from me when it got to the Porsche curves. But this race was so exhilarating, and again I say I absolutely love wet races. I know that it again is a contrary opinion because there are so many people in the sim racing community who absolutely abhor the idea of racing in the wet. I think it's because they just presume that all of the races are going to be carnage. Now, granted, if you're racing in maybe a rookie series or in a pickup series or just open lobbies and there's nothing on the line, I can understand it. There are going to be people in there that are underprepared, they're going to be YOLOing every lap, they're not going to be in control of themselves, let alone their cars, so I can imagine there will be carnage. Get on track with other drivers that you can respect, drivers that you race against regularly, drivers where you know what you can and cannot get away with, drivers that you know are also as prepared as you and as in control of their vehicle as you are, and the racing is just intense. Yes, people are going to make mistakes, of course they're going to make mistakes, the track's wet or greasy, the grip levels are just inconsistent. However, the spray, the lack of visibility, the lack of traction, it just means you have to race at your absolute best if you're going to go wheel to wheel, door handle to door handle with someone else at over 200 kilometers per hour when you can't see anything except misty rain. And what I love about the rain when you're racing is it's a great leveler. In the dry, perfect grip conditions, the absolute fastest drivers are just going to drive away from you into the sunset. But if they don't spend a lot of time racing in the rain, people that do and are a little bit more comfortable in it and are less aggressive, maybe slower in normal conditions, but are quite controlled and finessed, they can all of a sudden find themselves performing and punching way above their weight in a wet race because other people aren't able to drive 10 tenths as they normally would. Again, how can you not like it? How can you not find it enjoyable? Why would you not want more races to be in the wet? And so much was I enjoying this race that by the time I started my third stint, which would be the final stint other than the splash and dash, I genuinely had hopes of finishing on the podium. If everything went right, if I didn't make any mistakes, if I maximized every single lap, nailed my pit entrance, nailed my exit, there was a good chance that as others had to pit and maybe take on more virtual energy or maybe even more fuel, that I could find myself sneaking onto the final step of the podium. But I was under no illusions, I wasn't deluding myself, nothing had been won yet, and since I'd screwed myself over in the second race and hadn't executed 100% in the first race, I knew that I had to race every single lap as though it was the first lap of the race, the second lap of the race, and that nothing had been won yet, just to make sure that my focus didn't drop, that I didn't become complacent, that I didn't make some stupid mistake in the rain and throw it all away. However, I also wasn't going to be hesitant. I wasn't going to be reserved. I wasn't going to be submissive. I was having the most fun I've had at Le Mans, in Le Mans Ultimate, since September 2024. No way was I going to give up on the opportunity to have the best, the most exhilarating, the most fun when it came to racing here in the rain. So with another BMW in my sights, again, I was locked in, target acquired. I again had to make this move. I was less than half a second back, and if I didn't get it done before we got to Arnage, I knew I would be stuck behind him again, going through the Porsche curves, and that might put paid to my plans of getting onto the podium. But I wasn't going to be stupid. After 35 minutes of racing, there was no way that I was going to just outbrake him and just throw it into the Michelin chicane. Not in these conditions, not with no guarantees that they wouldn't turn in, that they even knew that I was there. So again, it was a case of back out, live to fight another day, and see if I could position myself perfectly for the run coming off Mulsanne. And did I say, we were only halfway through the race at this point. My heart rate was up at 155 beats per minute. I was living on my last nerve. But again, in the rain, the racing was so intense, so insane, so much fun. I would do this again and again and again. And what was surprising was I felt so composed, so controlled, I was so focused on moving forward rather than just holding on to the positions that I had. I just felt that in this race I had everything to gain. It was well within my control, and it was just surreal because it's like I flicked a switch in the last race of the trophy series, decided to stop being conservative with my, speaking of being conservative, as if this hypercar came racing no one at this point of the race and completely interfered with our race into Arnage. I feel for Kevin at this point because he just wanted to line me up to see if he could make the position back before we got to the Porsche curves, before we had to hit pit lane. However, I digress. So where was I? Yeah, as if I stopped being conservative, as if I actually put some time and effort into extracting more performance from the setup, and then rocked up to the final race in the trophy series at Le Mans and found 2 seconds. And then took the week off in the sabbatical between the end of season 1 and the start of season 2 and retained those 2 seconds when we rocked up to the first race of the weekend. Now, I don't want to jinx myself, but I hope that's the level of performance I can take through the entire season 2, because I'd like to have more races like this again. However, we were hitting pit lane for the penultimate time. Again, everything to gain. Hitting pit lane, I had finally made the decision all the way from Arnage up to the Porsche curves. I wasn't sure whether I was going to change tyres, not change tyres. I just had to make a decision, and I decided I'm going to gamble that the track stays damp at minimum, that it never gets to a fully dry track, and that I can keep the tyres alive by keeping to the wet side of the track going down Mulsanne. In race 2, my front left had got down to something like 65, maybe 66% of tyres tread left, and that's what had prompted me to make the change. I didn't want to get a puncture. I didn't want to get to the point where I didn't have any grip and I had a moment coming through Indianapolis, or a moment and lost grip going through the Porsche curves. However, because the race was going so well and I wanted to be as aggressive with my strategy as possible, I decided no change. I would much rather the tyre blew and that I finished maybe 2-3 positions down, but I knew I had raced my heart out, than to give up everything I'd gained up until this point in the race by being uber conservative again. And it worked. Leaving the pit lane after my final splash and dash, I was in second place with a hard charging third coming up from a second back. A hard charging third who lost it going through Indianapolis and almost wrecked my race. Having dodged a bullet at Sebring at the back end of the trophy series in season 1 in very similar circumstances, I was shocked to see that I escaped death yet again, that Le Mans Ultimate cashed in 2 of my 9 lives and allowed me to live to fight another day. I came out of the Ford chicane after 90 minutes, crossed the line and finished in second place. My first week in the multi-class series, my first podium, and whilst it wasn't the strongest strength of field, it's my strongest result here yet to date. Next up is Fuji, a track I absolutely hate. How did your week go? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, a like, a share and a subscription would be great.